Hello, welcome to our podcast. I'm your host, Larry Liu, and today I'm joined by Wenhui Xie. He's currently a PhD student at the Department of Philosophy in the University of Oklahoma. And I had you on, I think, last year or so, right, for a while back. So we just pick up on, basically a random conversation. Things that sort of motivated you or interested you, or things that you thought about in the recent past, whether it's with your philosophical research or whether it's about something that's happening in the world. Uh, where do you want to start?
So yes, of course, I'm very glad to join you again, and this is my honor and certainly my pleasure. Uh, I do have something that I actually would like to ask you about, and that would be what in Chinese called the 内卷 phenomenon. I don't quite know the exact translation of that, but it's the phenomenon I think you're familiar with, and which is that, in my words, an intense, unhelpful, escalating competition that's happening in multiple different fields. So give you an example. In China, general education system seems to be going through that kind of process where you have, I think everybody knows, too many people competing for very limited seats at the top schools. And so starting from kindergarten, parents are getting crazy. And let me be specific. Parents in cities, parents in countryside, they don't have any say in that game. But parents in cities, they are getting crazy, starting from kindergarten and then going through elementary school, middle school, high school, all through the entire process, getting very intense and very excessively competitive to get their kids to the best schools, so as to squeeze out a little more chance to get to the top schools. Um, this is just one example of the phenomenon. I don't recall the English name of that. But last time we just talked on online, you mentioned that this is, let me say, last time you said something like, if China is going through this process, it's not that different from the US. So I just want to know from you, what's your observation? What have you seen?
Well, about the level of competitiveness that exists in Chinese culture, or more recently, especially. Um, and I, I, so I would say, yeah, I think there is a comparability between the U.S. and the Chinese culture um, when it comes to getting into the top schools, top universities. That there's a greater anxiety about, especially upper middle class parents, to ensure that the kids can retain the same level of socioeconomic status as they do. And that's fundamentally made more complicated by the fact that there aren't that many positions, upper middle class positions. And also, there aren't that many top universities, and therefore also not many top slots. Um, I would say there's somewhat of a distinction, obviously, because there are a lot of Chinese students who want to go to American universities, who think that taking the SAT or GRE is actually an easier feat to accomplish than trying to do well on the Gaokao that entitles you to go to the Chinese top universities. So, relatively speaking, you could say that um, the barrier to get in to the top universities in China would be much higher because of the higher academic performance standards that's part of being uh, of getting into top Chinese university. Um, I just wanted to raise a third culture that I would be familiar with, which is, you could say, the Central European, Austrian, German
Mhm, mhm,
culture, because I grew up in Austria. And over there it's very interesting because you know it is different from both the American as well as the Chinese culture in terms of education, because over there it matters much less for you to succeed and get into top universities. And part of the reason is that um, so the flagship, the main universities that we have, for instance, in Austria, is they're all public universities. So University of Vienna, which have different faculties. One for agriculture studies, one for technical studies like engineering, one for general social sciences, and so on and so forth. And you know, it, it's much easier to get in, to these universities, because all you need to have is you have to pass the matura. The matura is the final exam in high school, and as soon as you pass it, and by passing, I literally mean D or D minus. So
Wow.
you could basically get into a university. There's some exceptions, I think, for medicine. For some fields, I think
Hmm,
they
hmm.
do have a great cutoff, uh, but if you do, like a major like you and me in social science, humanities, I don't think there's any restriction on that. So um, and the implication of that is, when I grew up, with the other kids in high school, middle school, um, if you had like a C or a D, you really didn't care that much about it. It almost felt like there was no, emotional investment uh, in having top marks. There were always some students, who were considered to be the nerds, and they're like, oh, let me always be the teacher's pet. Let me always,
Hmm, hmm.
study as well as possible. Um, and so I always felt that, like, the U.S. called educational culture, as well as the Chinese educational culture, is much more focused on, like, the status anxiety. And I don't know, does it have maybe something to do with the fact that these are both superpowers? Maybe uh, they certainly the two countries at the very forefront of global supremacy. And yeah,
Yeah, we can probably just spend a few more minutes talking about this overall phenomena. And let me say this first, because you offered something interesting, and that I want to follow up. And that is the fact that this style of competition is a bit different from just being very competitive. So there's high competitiveness, and there's this thing which where the competition is a bit futile. And let me be more specific. Again, you used an example of Chinese Gaokao, or the college entrance examination. By saying futile, I mean they really need to the students really need to compete on very marginal differences. Their difference, they really need to spend a lot of time and energy fine tuning, honing the last few points. It's futile it's futile in the sense of really wasting their energy in and not really producing anything good, not really producing anything good for them, or for the let's say the country overall. Because if you are cutting people off just based on their little margins, when a much larger group of people are qualified for going to that school, you see that's detrimental for both the students and the country overall. And this style of competition, what I call, I mean, roughly translated as futile competition, is not uncommon, and it's present in, let's say, the the current U.S. academia. And you really need to, for new graduate students, squeeze out and cut your head to publish that one or two more papers. And even going down to getting into graduate schools, you already have something like that. You already need to have a level of competition that is not necessarily productive, so that it's not the high. Yeah, so it's not productive competitiveness. It produces a lot of waste of, let's say, roughly energy that could be diverted somewhere else and could lead to more roughly productiveness. So that's the important feature of this of nature, of the kind of phenomenon I'm asking about. And it is interesting why this would happen in the US and in China. One of the reasons that I read about is that there's a uniformity of goals. So if you have only one, let's say, standard of evaluation, then everybody everybody follow that standard of evaluation, then you have excessive competitiveness that just drive to the margin. That doesn't really lead to anywhere. And the article that I read complained precisely on this point. It complains about there being one route to life. And in China, they will be, going through the 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 education system, getting a decent, try to get to as good a school or college as you can, and then get like some kind of decent job, things like that. So there's a set track that the whole country seems to be set upon, and that track is what lead to is partly a contributor to this style of futile competition. Um, I don't have much to say about this view, saying that having a having a single standard ruins people's life roughly, because I am sympathetic to that, and I do see the U.S. as sharing some kind of that that pattern, the fact that there is one prominent standard of value, from prominent standardization according to which everybody goes after. Uh, so here's one question that I want to pursue and discuss with you. One from an economic and sociological perspective, which you are an expert in, a good reason for why this happened, this kind of one what central valuation system, why this happens, is because of the economic system we're in. Capitalism overall does drive a lot of attention to just this one route. That can be very roughly but effectively summarized as having more money equals more success, or more happy. It goes on and on. But then capitalism happens everywhere, in Europe as well. And here goes back to your example of Austria. It happens there as well. Why is it that you just, based on your personal experience, you just don't see that style of competition being played out?
Yeah, I mean that's a very good question. I mean again, I think you could make the argument where it has something to do with the two countries, U.S. China being superpowers and the other countries are not. Um, but it's perhaps also the satisfactory explanation. I mean, another commonality I think that U.S. and China have is that the welfare state is much less developed, and the
Mm-hmm.
implication of that is that there's a much greater status anxiety that exists. I mean, like you have to understand, like in terms of the patterns of the labor market, meaning the jobs that are growing at the fastest rate. Um, it's also the case in the European countries that it tends to be low wage jobs,
Yeah.
in the service sector, being servers, bartenders, delivery drivers, warehouse workers. I mean, those are the. I mean, it's the same category of jobs that's growing exponentially in European countries as they do in the US and in China.
Hmm.
Um, so I would say the patterns of the labor market is the same. Well, then what's the difference? And I think it has to do with the level of social protection that exists in these respective countries. Which is to say that, so if you are, let's say, graduating from high school in Austria and you have a, common laborer job, you know, the government protections that exist for you, like for instance, you have a child and you get the first year maternity paternity leave. I think it's a little bit more generous for women than for men, but still, there's some for each parent. Or you have some accident at work and you have to cover the medical bills for it. So of course, not you doing it, but the government does it. When you get to about age 60 to 65, um, there's a public pension system that is still fairly robust. I mean, it's getting less robust now because they wanted to hike the retirement age because of an aging population.
Hmm. Hmm.
But if you have this notion of we're going to have a cradle to grave kind of welfare system, I think it's going to take a lot of the anxiety out of people's lives.
The pressure. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and it might make them a little bit less focused on the competitive end. Um, Now you could make the argument, well, whether it's Baidu, Alibaba, or Apple, Google. I mean, it's only those two superpowers that are producing these kinds of companies, and the Europeans focus on what you might call like old world technology. So
Hmm.
they're very good, like with you know car manufacturing and
Hmm. Yeah.
industrial goods, machinery. Things that we've developed over more than a century, basically, right?
Yeah.
And which is still high value added, but these are not new world technology, not the newest
Yeah.
technologies. And that's surely a good counter argument. But then the question is like, do we really need all of that stuff, right? Like in order to be happy? I think that is a very huge question, um, and I would even say that that it creates unhappiness if we have if we are too focused on um, chasing the newest material goods. um, and yeah, so for me, like everything about capitalism has to be seen in context with the environment, with the ecology. I
Yeah.
think at this point, like, there's no way how you can separate these two spheres anymore, because the classical or neoclassical perspective about economics is that you know there's humans, then there's ingenuity or entrepreneurial talent, and then there's natural resources that we can exploit
Yeah.
in order to produce these new things.
Yeah. Nature as a reservoir of materials and stuff to be taken,
Yeah,
rather than let's say to be respected or to be co-lived or something like
exactly. And this is really what's screwed up, right? So with your phenomenon, which you might call like economic anxiety among the middle class for maintaining their status, their social
that. Hmm.
status. I'm just using sociological terms for
Yeah. Go
to
ahead. Yeah.
describe your phenomenon, what you
Yeah.
described. Um, and that status anxiety, I think, is directly connected with ecological calamity that's produced by climate change, by um, yeah, sort of like old ways of thinking, which is we need better is always more,
Yeah.
more is always better. And so I So just to address like the status anxiety thing, I mean, what are the two things that we could do about it? Well, you could have a Keynesian kind of solution, or you could have like an anti-capitalist solution. Um, so the Keynesian solution is you basically have to figure out how do you increase the number of middle class jobs, right? Because
Yeah.
the key source of anxiety that's happening is look at why is the education standards being pushed up and up on what's called feudal competition. What do you call it? Feudal competition. Um, well, it's because there aren't enough new middle class jobs. That's basically what it is. So then you have to address it directly. You say, hey, what are the industries that you have to create that would create middle class jobs? I mean, you could basically take existing, you could say, laboring jobs that are highly labor intensive but don't require a lot of brain intelligence. Um, and you could basically unionize them, and you could start paying them higher wages. Um, I saw, for instance, like recently a headline where because of the pandemic, people are not going to the college at the same rate as they used to before.
Hmm.
And, part of the reason could be that the pandemic caused a massive labor shortage. Um, Not because a lot of people died, I think. But the main reason is that there's a lot of people that are scared about going to work. So they stay home and then they get money from the government through unemployment insurance.
Yeah.
And so then what happens is that there's fewer available workers, the wages go up, right? Because
Hmm.
they have to compete for fewer workers.
Yeah.
Um,
Wall Street Journal just published. I mean, I think a few weeks ago or something like that. They just published a video talking about that.
yeah, exactly. So right, so yeah, that would be like I don't know whether it's a long term effect or it could be a short term effect because of the
Yeah.
pandemic. But we would have to think about something like what is it that we have to do to increase middle class jobs? And I think it's a huge order challenge. The problem with the Keynesian solution, however, is as I said, the ecology. So because higher living standard, high standard of living always means so far that we're burning more fossil fuels.
Yeah.
Um, even something as innocuous, we're like, hey, we're scholars, we're not polluting the environment. And then it turns out, well, we have to go to conferences in faraway places, take the airplane to get there. And then, we have to rent hotels and things like that. Okay. So regardless of what we do, it always means we're burning more fossil fuels. Okay. So then you say, okay, well, let's assume that the Keynesian solution sucks and we shouldn't go there, it's a very radical proposal. Uh, is to say you have to give meaning. And so now we go back to philosophy here,
Yeah.
meaning of life, um, outside of wage work. It's like basically the question is like, so if we go back to like, eudaimonia, which is this Aristotelian concept about, happiness, fulfillment. I would say fulfillment might be a better word than happiness because
Yeah. Fulfillment might be, yeah,
happiness
completely
is
happy.
more like a short-term thing. Yeah. So like contentment with life. Uh, it has so in the ancient Greek sense. I mean, it has to come from seeking virtue. Now, but then the thing is, okay, well, what do you mean by virtue? And then it's like it's a little bit uncertain. But to simplify it for our world, um, it cannot be about jobs, and it cannot be about material consumption goods. Um, the contentment has to come from something else, and well, it have to come from maybe like a mixture of like social activities, doing more things with friends, with family members, people that we know. Um, it could also be, some community activity, maybe sports. um, and it would have to be sponsored through some basic income or universal social provision, right? Of basic needs. Um, yeah, it would be one of these two things that we have to think about. But yeah, it's very hard to sort of get out of this, uh, get out of the situation that we find ourselves in.
I mean, I would agree. Roughly, there are two things we need to do um, to combat this. Yeah, okay. Let me backtrack. Coming out of futile competition, there are so many problems. One of which you mentioned would be a lack of overall meaning. What am I doing, or what other people who are involved in those competitions do? They are not adding value, and they know they're not adding value. You ask the students who involved in training for years to do that exam, they're not doing much. They're not doing much in the sense of improving themselves. It's mainly that exam machine, and they know that they know that's what they're doing. And um and going to we have been using this example of education, but the examples abound. There are plenty of examples of this kind of competition in other fields. And so to get into so one problem we mentioned would be that it's kind of meaningless in the sense of not really helping the individual, not really utilizing the individual's talent, and not really being beneficial to the society overall. To get out of these problems, I do agree with you that there are at least two things we need to do. First, we need to have some level of basic protection. And this, I let me make a minor complaint against a tendency in philosophy, and that would be a tendency to exaggerate what intellect can do. That exaggeration would be that roughly there are things I can control, and then there are things I cannot control. All I need to do is to focus on what I can control and ignore the things I cannot control, and so that can safeguard my happiness or something like that. I'm not gonna bore you and the audience about where exactly that line of thought comes from, but it's pretty it's popular since antiquity in either the Greek tradition or the Chinese tradition. There's something like that has been floating around. I think something is wrong about that, because it takes things a bit too it takes life a bit too easily. What So one example would be, let's say, wealth. Wealth is not something strictly I can control. I mean, I can try, but there's no guarantee I'm gonna make big money. And so under that style of thinking, under that line of thinking, I shouldn't be worried about material wealth and stuff like that. And that is where I think it gets off. I mean, I think, just like all philosophy, I think material wealth shouldn't dominate one's thinking. But then to go the other side and to say that, yeah, that's something I shouldn't pay attention to, that either reveals privilege or reveals naivety. Money is important, for saving a basic human dignity. You tell people who lack insurance and have serious disease that they shouldn't care about money is equal to mocking them in their face that your life has no value. Now, how that's um, that's the kind of not very good tendency that sometimes philosophy can get into. Focus too much on what I can do, what my ideas or my understandings can do to transcend me out of my corporeal existence. I'm not a big fan of that. So I do, and this go back to our previous conversation. So I do agree with you that there needs to be some basic level of support, and it's pretty concrete. It's material support. It's not intellectual, spiritual support. No, material supports need to be there. I think pandemic made it very clear. We have heard stories about how hospitalization in the pandemic period for getting to COVID can cause upward of millions, and that would be just crazy. Upward of a million. I mean, only those who are at the very top can pay for these kind of bills. But disease, healthcare, these things should be universal. Should have at least some safety protection for everyone. With that said, that's one component to one important component to deal with the problems of futile competition. The other then would be, if we have that, that base level of material support, then the other level would be something like a diversity of values. One thing that's pretty clear in the current Chinese cultural scene is a lack of diversification of values. I think in the US we also see that, but it's less extreme. In the while both countries are plagued by capitalism, China for some reason just have a stronger sense that there is just one route to life. I don't quite know what contribute to to this problem, but this is clearly a problem when your view of life is being really restricted.
Yeah.
Then
So
there's go ahead.
last time did we talk about tamping as a phenomenon? So
Yeah,
it's
yes.
right. So it's this idea of like people are leaning back and
Yeah,
they're sort of trying to escape the working hard kind of mill that we're otherwise would be in. Um, and and it's very interesting. So there was just this one New York Times article about it. So I haven't seen too much about it, but it's like a phenomenon that circulates around social media, and of course, because this internet censorship in China, so the
hmm
government authorities are trying to suppress people from posting things that celebrate laziness or taking
yeah,
it easy. But nonetheless, it is a phenomenon where, and it's basically caused by um, disappointment with the rat race. Um, you know, because of the what you mentioned, which is futility, right? It's like I try so hard, and I might not make it because there's other people who are even better at playing the game than I do. So it could be part of the reason, the resentment that you have against people that they're not smarter than you, but they're better at playing the game. Essentially, right? That's a key thing. And um, and then also like there's this Jojo Liu philosophy, right, where it's like
yeah,
996. So you're supposed to work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week. And yeah, and people are some people, usually those in like upper middle class households, like usually people that can live with their adult parents, like in their 20s and early 30s. If you're older than 35, I mean, it might be hard to live that like non-working lifestyle because your parents might not no longer be around, right? So but yeah, it's sort of like a form of resistance that is emerging in parts of Chinese society.
yeah.
And yeah, there's so much, yeah, disappointment. There's so much pressure that people have in their daily lives, and it's a fair question. It's like, were those people the tongue ping individuals, lying flat, I think is the translation. Um, what they're asking themselves very seriously is what is actually the meaning of life, and I think it's very fair for them
To
to
ask
ask
that
that.
question. Yeah,
Yeah, because so from like if you look from the Chinese Communist Party perspective, I mean, so for them, the main idea that's driving them, it's like this national rejuvenation, guojia fusing or something.
Yeah, yeah.
And an important part of national rejuvenation is that everybody works hard, and it's about pursuing national goals. It's about national greatness. So everything you can sell in that context. It's like, okay, well, why are the Chinese lending money to developing countries to build the infrastructure over there? That's because we have to basically draw more resources from the ground, ship it back to China. Chinese factories, we produce more things and we sell it to other countries. Um, so I mean, it's essentially this like idea of like capitalism, right, which emerged in Western Europe among Europeans, um, has now infected, you could say, the minds of people all over the world. But the best students, it seems to be, were the Chinese, right? Of capitalism, and they are the main applicators of that ideology. And then so there's always this question. I mean, in the left, it's like, well, if we agree that neoliberal capitalism is bad, well, is there strategies how we can evade it?
Yeah.
And and the tamping, the lying flat phenomenon, I think, is a really good case study for this is what we're trying to do to undermine the national ideology for growth
It
and
is these people I mean, lying down as as a life attitude is pretty funny. First of all, they just call lie down. It just means, which implies, yeah, whatever comes, man. I just take it. Whatever comes. I'm not fighting back. I'm not standing up. I just lie down. Whatever comes, okay, flood me away. It is funny, and also very sad. And what motivates these reaction, this attitude towards life, is a sense of hopelessness. Okay, so um, hope is interesting in that the thing you hope for don't you don't well, I should say, you don't always know that the thing you hope for will come true. And that's what hope is about. There is a level of uncertainty, which is why you hope for it to become real. But hopelessness means that that thing you desire, that thing you consider good, it's just not coming true. It will not come to fruition, and it will not be realized. So for these people, what they lie down because they they basically think that their life cannot really improve to what they desire to be a fair
but you're saying
standard.
that they still agree with the national goal, with the national ideology, right?
Yes, I think so. Yeah. To some degree, they still agree with that general, that one path lifestyle of thinking. And that's why when they seriously consider themselves unable to attain that, they give up.
Yeah. So
And let me be more specific. It doesn't mean that they hold a very high standard. That national rhetoric has levels of standard, let's say. It doesn't mean that they hold it very high. It just means that for them, they don't see any way of attaining any of that.
yeah. So I was thinking of there's another interesting social phenomenon that's happening in Japan, and they call it hikigomori, and I think it's translated as extreme social withdrawal, right?
Oh, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and um, and I was thinking, I mean, like it's certainly within the same family of the tamping
Yeah,
phenomenon,
exactly. Yes.
but I do think there's one important distinction here, um, which is the extremity of it. Like if you think about the continuum where um, hikikomori, I think, is like complete social withdrawal, which is to say these are kids, these are young adults, who don't leave the bedroom,
Yeah,
uh,
yeah,
and um, and then the parents are usually enabling them by, for instance, not forcing them out of the house,
yeah,
and by feeding them essentially, right? So it's
yeah,
like they basically, take a plate of food, put it outside the bedroom, and
yeah,
then they
yeah,
and then they pick up the empty plates again, and then and then through that, the young adult can basically not leave the bedroom for years essentially.
yeah.
um and I don't know whether tamping in China gets to the level of the hikigomori in Japan. um you know is I almost feel like, I mean, is it the case like in Japan that's the like the force of like social ostracism is much more powerful, right?
Yeah, I have a sense that what's happening in Japan, I should say this. I watched the documentary about it, and then my impression is that what causes Japan to have a similar problem is a bit different from the Chinese case. In China, it has a clear socio-economic reason behind it. And in Japan, there is also a socio-economic reason behind it, which is roughly a stagnation of, you know, or I should say stratification of classes. You just feel like you cannot go anywhere. But there seems that there is another reason for the Japanese counterpart, which has to do with social humiliation. Yes, social humiliation or something like ostrac or being those people being ostracized, and that can have an economic component to it, but not necessarily. It seems to happen on a different round, and just being called certain names by pals, by people of the same age, or being humiliated publicly and things like that. Same,
Well, among
but
the
I
case
should stop
studies,
there. Go
well, I
ahead.
mean, among the case studies that I saw, from also from a documentary,
Yeah,
it tends to be people that, so in high school, let's say,
yeah,
they have the ranking system, which actually it's very similar to the Chinese school system, right? So it's like you rank the students from the top performer to the poorest performer. And now then the question always becomes like, well, what happens with the people lower down?
mhm,
um they would be ostracized, they would be made fun of. And and because group harmony is sort of the most important principle, generally in Confucian societies, but I would say even more extremely in Japan.
yeah,
um,
yeah. I would agree.
then, okay, is it the group doesn't approve of you? Well, what's the only support source? Is to basically go back to your bedroom, to your parents' bedroom, right? And yeah, and I feel like, I mean, it's I don't know whether Chinese society works exactly according to that principle of like humiliation. I mean, is there's some. I mean, there's always this issue of like how much individual discretion do you have? Because in Western society, I mean, the stratification that you were referring to, it's basically the same. I mean,
Yeah,
you have in Southern Europe, like in Italy and Greece and Spain, Portugal, you have unbelievable rates of youth unemployment. It's like 40%, 50%, 60% even. And so, uh, but you could still have a girlfriend, if you're a guy,
yeah,
you probably live in, yeah, your parents' bedroom. um but you could still go out. I mean, with just a little bit of money, you could
yeah,
maybe drink a beer once a week or something like that, party, um because it's a much more individualist society, right? It's like
yeah, yeah,
there's no collective group that can like take up a stone and throw it at you,
Yeah,
for for not performing, for not getting a good job and things like that, right? um
yeah, literally or figuratively. And I think that is a major difference between China and, let's say, the countries you mentioned. There indeed is a national rhetoric for the Chinese, and that national rhetoric is all by and large taken by the majority of Chinese. And so let me elaborate on what I mean. There's this term called 三河大神, which roughly translated as the gods living in this area called 三河. They're not gods. They're actually, if you look at them, they have nothing to common with gods. What they do, what their lifestyle, you can perhaps even call them parasites of the society, because they do nothing. They do literally nothing. All they can do is to get a little bit money from begging or from some sources, and they spend it on basic food or playing games, and that's it. They reject. Okay, here's why they're called gods. They reject to participate in the labor market. They just don't work. They refuse to work. It's a very extreme version of what we're talking about. The tamping people. They're the among the people who undertake this lying down attitude towards life. This group goes to the greatest extreme. They reject get back to
they
work.
have like a religious component
No,
to
no,
what
they
they're
just
doing.
they for it is I am interested in the psychology. I haven't been studying their psychology, but they don't have a religion. They're really being just called God for being extreme. It's got nothing to do with religion. It's just that these people are living such an extreme, crazy life that they're called the gods. The reason I mention is because for me, part of what make them to live that lifestyle is, ironically, their identification with this national rhetoric. Again, it is this extreme hopelessness that they will be attain any part of the national dream, any benefit of the national development that they gave up.
Right. I mean, and that's really, I think, another issue that has to be thought about, which is, you know, does it make sense for a country to organize around a goal? And
Yeah, yeah,
um, so, I mean, it's not a clear yes or no, because I mean, if you think about, let's say, an issue that I think everybody around this planet would basically be in agreement with, is how do we fight climate change?
yeah.
Um, for that or how do we defeat the pandemic? For those kinds of things, that is where the universal existence is being threatened. I would say that declaring national goals is a very good thing to do,
Mhm.
um, and we should find ways how to hold people accountable to them. Now, but the problem is that if your goal is economic growth for its own sake, or for the sake of global domination, um, then I think there's going to be a problem with that narrative, because well, partly because it's going to produce losers
Yeah.
inevitably, like the tamping phenomenon again, um, and also um, the losers could be everybody at the end. You know,
Yeah.
um, now because of externalities like climate change or causing a new pandemic, things like that. Um, Now, but then I don't know. I saw this article in Forbes this morning. It was about nuclear power plants that's being built in China, and there's like dozens of new nuclear energy projects that are being designed. And I looked at the map of China. And it's very interesting that a lot of the existing nuclear plants, they were all built on the coastline. Um, and I would think like, if you had like a massive tsunami that was coming down the shores of China, in the same way that it was in Fukushima in Japan like 10 years ago, um, I would think it would be a huge mistake
Yeah.
to have those nuclear power plants operating right there at the coastline. Um, so I guess the point being that like that nuclear energy isn't risk free, but from the perspective of the national development goals, which is how do you increase electricity production, which is essential to economic development, at the same time as you reduce the carbon footprint. And nuclear energy has been used as a means to accomplish both of these objectives. Um, and it's very interesting because if you look at the global um, nuclear energy um, planning, you could see that basically it's all about China. I mean, China is the one country
Yeah.
that wants to do it very aggressively because I mean, in the U.S. it's sort of like the 3 Mile Island accident in 1979. It's in Pennsylvania.
Fill me in.
Um, yeah, I mean, there was a nuclear accident essentially, not at the same scale as Chernobyl or Fukushima, but it was an accident, and I think ever since then, they didn't, invest in trying to create new, power plants. The U.S. still gets a lot of its energy sources, about 1/5 of it, I think, from nuclear energy, but mainly from plants that is already very old, right? So between 30 and 60 years old, right? Um, so the country would have to discuss, putting in new nuclear energy sources. Um, but China is doing that very, very aggressively right now, um, and it's a way for them to say, "Hey, we can grow the economy, we can have compound growth, and we can save the CO2." And I actually am not sure whether that's going to succeed. I think it's a little bit too optimistic, the narrative.
Yeah, I don't quite know. Let me comment on this point from a more general perspective. China is fascinating because, I mean, even as a Chinese, I find it fascinating because it, in short, developed, in short, let me restart. It goes through in 40, 50 years, a couple hundred years of development that the West has gone through. And so you really have a mixture of phenomenon nowhere seen on Earth. I don't know, maybe before. I don't know whether it will happen in the future, but at least not before. You have, I mean, China is gradually eradicating poverty and even extreme poverty. But put that aside, you have great stratification of economic class, not to say any other classes in China. And that resembles in the US. But the stratification is even worse, I think, in China compared to the US. The US has like the richest of the rich, but China has someone who are fairly rich, not at the US level, but the bottom is lower. In terms of technological development, you see the same phenomenon. In some area, China is really catching up, even to the top level. But then in other areas, you see a lot of the infrastructure. I'm not talking about the bridges and stuff like that. No, I'm talking about something smaller. Let's say something like smaller at the civil level, like toilet papers and stuff like that. Or the widespread of hygiene and stuff like that. It's not it in rural areas. It's still catching up. It's just that the level of um, put it roughly, you see the almost the worst of human living condition in China, and also almost the top in China. And And so that itself produced a lot of complex phenomenon. It's fairly interesting on itself. I want to so that's my quick comment to and yeah, so that's the first comment. And how does it relate back to your comment? You know, can China succeed with its goal of reducing carbon footprint and sustaining its economic growth? I would also agree that it's fairly optimistic to do that, but I have no clue whether China can pull it off. Everybody, I mean, shits on CCP, and it's got plenty to shit on. But there's also no deny that it's pulled off some marvelous improvements, some marvelous feats. I honestly don't quite know what will happen in term and let's say in terms of carbon footprint reduction. China is continuing, like you know it well. China continues to build coal plants, but it also builds a lot of, as you just mentioned, nuclear plants, and it is very progressive in terms of solar and wind energy. They're actually, in terms of just producing and building these power plants, new clean power plants, China is also leading the market. I don't quite know what to say regarding your question. Is China, I mean, more specifically, is CCP too optimistic? I don't know. I do know that no one can fault China for not having long-term plans.
But
They
even for
do.
that last comment, I mean, it does make me pessimistic for one reason. So when you say like they're very good at, you know, nuclear and solar and wind, like non-carbon energy sources, um, and in the midst of all of this, they're still building the coal plants
Yeah,
just because the total demand for electricity is that like the curve of that is so steep, right? It's like even if you invested tons tons of resources in the non-carbon energy sources, you would still like just to meet the demand gap, right? You still have to open up the coal plants, and
yeah.
that to me, it's like, oh man, that's a really bad signal to me. It's like where it's I- like if we wanted to be more sustainable, I think the demand curve for the over time for electricity has to
Come
flatten.
down.
Yeah,
Oh man. Right,
and
right.
that would mean that could be conflict, because
Yeah,
like there's a poverty alleviation target that the Chinese government has,
yeah,
and I agree that you cannot meet poverty reduction unless you increase the energy demand, right? Um, because your higher living standard usually means it means electrification essentially.
yeah,
It
yeah,
means increasing mobility. People can drive cars and
yeah,
get to places more easily. It's about installing air conditioning and heating units so that they're more comfortable during the year, whatever, and so forth. And yeah, so it's yeah, that to me is a big issue. It's like because I guess my point is like it's not just China. It's like globally. The main challenge is, yeah, I mean, how do you keep everybody happy to some extent by, you know, improving the standard of living materially, um, but at the same time you're not increasing the carbon footprint. Um, and it's a dance that we haven't really figured it out. I mean, I think a lower hanging fruit would be, I think we could agree that like people that already live in rich countries, or in the Chinese case, in rich parts of the country like Beijing, Shanghai, etc. Um, like they have to think about like constraint, right? Like this idea that, okay, well maybe I don't go traveling as often. Um, you know,
Oh,
if I
that
live if
you're.
I live
I
in
feel like you're asking something harder than el- eliminating poverty in China. To
yeah,
ask those who are rich, who have the capacity to spend, to waste, to constrain their consumption,
right, and then you would allow the poor to
to
rise
to
up to a
catch up
certain
or
level.
something.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Um,
feel like you're asking. I mean, that would be ideal, but I feel like you're asking something more challenging than just get rid of poverty all over.
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, again, because like the assumption that okay, we can do poverty alleviation without retaining a relationship with nature, I think that's just illusory. I just before we
Yeah, yeah,
started the
I see.
call,
I think that's. I think you're making a good point. The fact that there are a lot of pessimism about the, let's say, the green initiatives, the global green initiatives, because you have data to track what exactly has happened, for the past, I don't know, since 83 or something like that, we have the first global scale green collaborative initiative. And it seems like it did nothing. By did nothing, I mean we never met the goal, and then the consumption and like just it seems like it has done nothing. So it's a pretty passive. I mean, not pessimistic. Pessimistic. It is a factual report that can really make a lot of people pessimistic about global collaboration. But I think you made a good point. It is not that we simply failed. We have increased our life standard as well, and there with increased supply standard, as you just said, there will be increase of energy demand, energy consumption, and so we're not exactly catching up with the old. So let's say if we set a standard in 83, and by the time of 1990 we failed, we're not necessarily failing the standard we set at 1983, but we may be failing to catch up with the standard of living and everything together of 1990. And for us to really cut down the overall carbon consumption, so to speak, I think you're right. We might need to do better than. So let me put it differently. The technology and overall collaboration of green initiatives need to move at a faster pace than the increase of our living standard if we really want to reduce the global carbon production.
yeah, I mean, and the big assumption again is that energy consumption and CO2 emissions is would be divorceable. I think so far the answer is no. It's not been divorceable because you could say,
Yeah,
okay, what about countries like Sweden? I mean, Sweden is really a leading country where you have 2 to 3% economic growth every year. For the past 3 decades, let's say, and at the same time they have cut the carbon emissions by half or something, right? It's a very steep reduction. But then I think there's a problem with that accounting, because we know that a lot of the carbon emission come from industry, from manufacturing, and if the manufacturing plants have been shipped to China
yeah,
or they've been shipped to Asia broadly, um, and then you take what's produced there, you put it on a tanker, on a giant ship, uh, and then you ship it back to Europe, right?
yeah,
Or you put it on a train, that's the Belt Road Initiative, right? Take it through Central Asia and then into Europe. Um, you know, like for me, this example clearly shows that this idea of like decarbonization, we haven't really achieved it because the only relevant unit of analysis for carbon emissions is at the global level.
yeah,
That's the only one that matters. I mean, you're 36 billion tons
yeah,
last year, and it's been a really, really sharp curve upwards. um, and China is the fastest growing, but then you have India, which is of course second biggest population. It's going to overtake China soon. Um, and yeah, so we're going to be back to the square one again. And yeah, so so that's a big worry that I have. So it was just before we started the conversation. I was watching this documentary. It was about bauxite mining in Jamaica. So bauxite is like I think it's a key input in like aluminum, which is used in a lot of like industrial goods that we have. Um, and they've been doing bauxite mining now for 60 years or so, since the 1950s. And what's very interesting is that the government in Jamaica is like the majority owner
Uh-huh.
of the bauxite mining extraction company, and they work together with an American company, a Russian company, and a Chinese company to basically parcel out the land. And the government earns tax revenues because that's the main incentive for them to do the extraction. But the losers of that trend is the people that's living in those areas where
In the
they do the
areas,
mining.
yeah.
So the main waste product. So there's two things that happen, right? So first, the groundwater that the population draws on is getting polluted.
Hmm.
So you're drinking polluted water, and you can imagine what it means in terms of like kidney failure and cancer and things like that.
Hmm.
And then the second waste product is goes through the air.
Yeah.
So like whatever they scraped out, it's like whoosh, there's like all this debris that goes through the villages, and they have like the hairs falling out. They breathe it in, which means that they have shortness of breath. They have lung cancer and things like that. Um, and also they're barely getting any money from that, right?
Yeah.
Because it's not like that the Jamaican state comes in and says, "Hey, here's some welfare money. We're going to take care of you guys." It's um, so I was just thinking, it's like it happens with everything, like everything that's extractive. But if you ask yourself, well, what does it mean to be wealthy? What it means to be wealthy is to drive cars, to take an airplane, to eat variety of foods, um, and all of the things that we regard as like living wealthy means usually that the source material is some extraction of mining,
Hmm.
mining of like natural resources. And yeah, I mean, for me, this is an example. I mean, there's like hundreds, thousands of examples of that, right, throughout the world. And it's just like, again, I go back to this question, like, what creates happiness? Like, is it the increase in the value in your bank account that creates happiness? Or is it just I don't know, living a chill life? I mean,
Yeah.
like like they were they were showing in the documentary like the Jamaicans, they're very good drummers, bongo drummers, um, and you know, yeah, it's like a very yeah non-extractive kind of lifestyle. It's definitely a primitive lifestyle, and by World Bank standards, I mean,
Yeah. They're
you'd
probably
probably be
extreme
living in
poverty.
poverty. Yeah, you'd be living in
Yeah.
poverty. But I don't know. I mean, it's like, are you really like I think you would be really poor, like if you froze to death, or outside, heat stroke death, and you're starving. I think
Yeah,
that's like really really poor. But like I don't know, even like these really poor communities. I mean, they do have enough food to eat, right? Um, yeah, it might not be a stable food supply. Okay, that's an issue, but you know, I was just thinking, well, maybe we should learn something from them, rather than
yeah.
them learning something from us.
I mean, your example of these Jamaican people's life really make me wonder about exploitation. There are clearly these people living around the mining area are clearly being exploited. And they're being, I mean, they're just almost an archetype of exploitation. No, they live in the area with no, they're living in an area that has been destroyed. It wasn't like that before, but now their living area has been destroyed. They got no compensation from the government, from the companies, and then they lack the ability to move away. And they just all they can do is just suffer through it. And I don't know. Yeah, I don't quite know what else they can do to improve their standard of living.
Well,
And
protest.
it protest, yeah. And maybe that documentary contribute to some effort of improving their life. I don't quite know. And yeah, so that really reminds me of exploitation, like how so here is another example. Okay, it's not in Jamaica, it's in US. It's about Netflix. I don't quite know enough about Netflix, but then there's something about their hiring statements strike me as potentially exploitative. And this is why I say it. In their hiring statements, they made it very clear that they don't have a clear what's that called, vacation dates or something like that. You can take off whenever you want. You can even take off midday. And it's just that. Here's the catch: you need to make sure that you catch up with the work.
So they
Oh, this
never
is a rough
lighten the
pair.
load.
So you know exactly what I'm talking about. When I taught my students, they didn't quite pick it up. They were all fascinated by the glorious fact that you can take off whenever you want. They didn't quite catch the second part. The second part means that you're never off work. Saying something you can take off even midday, but you need to catch. It just means you're never off work. Even on your off days, you're supposed to think about your work. That, to me, is potentially exploitative. If not, if not outright exploitative. I don't. And the actual situation need to be confirmed by Netflix workers. I'm not gonna make assumptions here, but that again to me it signals potential danger to me. You have the freedom to do whatever you want, take off whenever you want, but be sure to catch up.
But
Stuff like
but
that.
the important thing is like they don't lighten the load of the work, right? It's always like consistent and I mean, but here's a thing also that like imagine you have like two workers at the same job, right? But they have two different ability levels.
Yeah.
So which is to say that so let's say worker A is efficient and worker B is less efficient. So you can imagine worker A could finish the load in let's say 20 hours, out of the 40 that are allocated, and worker B needs the whole 40 hours to finish the work. And like in that situation,
It seems ages have more free time, right?
yeah, exactly. A would say, "Hey, the Netflix policy is amazing. That's great. Let's do
I
it."
mean, I doubt it. I doubt it. I actually doubt it because A's do have supervisors. If your supervisor doesn't really stop, and I think that's written in in the hiring statements. Even the supervisors will take off whenever they want, but they will make sure that they finish the work. So that's a top down style of pressure. Yeah, you can as a worker finish your part, let's say 20 hours or 20 hours faster than your coworkers, but you're not off the hook. You always have more stuff to do. You always have more stuff to do assigned, or just like not necessarily assigned, but something like you should know you have more work to do. Look at your supervisor, look at those people, look at your competitors. You should devote to your company. You should work more to promote, to develop the company. You should in what's the buzzword?
But then what's the
Oh,
point of like having that supposed schedule freedom?
that for me would be the suspicion. That would be my suspicion.
That there is no
When
schedule
you're,
freedom.
yeah, that for me would be my suspicion. This is the catch of words like freedom. It's a buzzword that triggers delight in the American mind, let's say. But the opposite side of it, the implication of it, often
Yeah, yeah. Well,
the catch.
so close by my parents' place in Philadelphia, they had this supermarket. It was called Retina,
Uh-huh.
and outside the, I mean, it's a normal supermarket, but then outside it said in big letters, "This is an employee-owned store."
Hmm.
And I was like, "Oh, that sounds really good, right?" Because it means
Yeah,
there's no evil capitalist bosses, whatever. So I
yeah.
go and I ask one of these workers, "Well, what does a company mean by employee-owned?" And the worker says that when you started working at that place, after like a month or so, you can buy company stocks.
Uh-huh.
But I was like, okay, but that doesn't make you any different than any other investor who wanted to invest in that company, right?
Yeah.
It's like maybe they have like a preferred,
Discount. Yeah.
yeah, like maybe a discount to buy the stock or something like that. But to me, it sounded like that's total BS, man. It is not an employee-owned company because
Yeah.
if you have like, let's say, I don't know, the company issues, let's say, you know 10 million stocks, 10 million shares, and then you own like one or two shares. I mean, like, sure, I mean, on paper you're a co-owner because that's what
Yeah. Yeah.
shareholding means,
Yeah.
but
You
but
met
you
you it does
but it
not
doesn't
matter
mean
at
anything.
all.
Yeah, it doesn't mean anything. I mean, in terms of actual power. So if you say, like, for me, like when you say employee-owned company, it means that there would be like general assemblies, almost like in the parliamentary setting, right? Where you'd basically discuss, okay, this is the shipment that we received this week. These are the products that we want to invest in next month. This is where the future demand is going to be. So let's invest into this area. Let's improve this part of the company, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's really basically managerial decisions
Hmm.
and that's being done at the plant level. And the only company where I know that they do this the best is the Mondragon Corporation, that's based in the Basque territory in Spain, and it's not a completely flat hierarchy, right? So you still have CEOs, you still have upper managers,
Hmm.
but who make the sort of the you could say the big decisions, but then also there would be consultation. So they would have meetings with the lower level employees, and their input would be recorded. Um, and so it's like a mixture. It's a mixture of like a private capitalistic corporation with a managerial structure, but it also incorporates those elements of democracy.
Hmm.
And that's a company that, yeah, I think you can call this employee owned in the real sense. Um, yeah, but the way how they sold it at the supermarket is just still bullshit.
Yeah. Yeah. I would agree. There's another thing that I do want to catch up with you on and really hear what you think. And I think this will be an ongoing topic that will last for years to come. And it is the influence of COVID. COVID, I mean, last year, there are people who compare COVID to, like, black swan phenomenon. You know what I mean?
It's like an extreme phenomenon that nobody could have predicted.
Yeah. And the influence is extremely huge and still unpredictable because we are in the early stages of COVID influence. Given the fact that it hasn't passed, we are still under the reign of COVID, and it's just
Yeah, so I think there's one qualification that we have to make, which is
go ahead.
um, it's all about the vaccination. Because I mean, like if you look at the COVID map now, they
Uh-huh.
show, okay, this is where the Delta variant
Uh-huh.
is spreading, and like the area that we're in, like in like northeast, um, like New York, Philadelphia, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, um, we have low to moderate risk of the Delta variant, and we have fairly decent rates of vaccination.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, if you look at mobility data, I mean, I don't think that we're you know moving around less than in high infection areas like in Missouri, for instance, or in Alabama and Louisiana. Um, the main problem that we are facing is in areas that have low rates of vaccination. So if you look, I think Indonesia is now being very badly hit. The Japanese, they were very disciplined for a long time until, of course, the Olympics happened, which is happening now.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, it's like, oh my God, look at these thousands of patients, um, because they're telling the Japanese people that they should stay home basically while the Olympics is happening. Of course, they're not doing that because one of the exciting things is that precisely that you have the Olympics, so let's gather in the bar and
Yeah. Yeah.
let's watch the game, right? And things like that. Okay, so and yeah, and Indonesia is very badly hit because they have high population density area, and they have low rates of vaccination, still less than 10%, I think. Um, so this is a really big assumption. It's like if let's say by the end of next year, when you can literally reach the entire world through herd immunity, which is either means infection, natural infection, or vaccination.
Mm-hmm.
um, I, I think this virus is going to be finished.
The
Um,
virus is going to be finished sooner or later, and of course, we all wish it can be done sooner, but the impact. And so, yeah, so let's discuss about the impact. That's what I am interested about. The economic impact, and it's the economic impact, the cultural impact, the social impact. Let me just raise some of the questions and see, and I don't quite know what to say about them, except that I have these suspicions that they might be here to stay. In the US, it's a bit interesting. Let me state what I have in mind and then say why I think it's interesting. I have before the I have this suspicion last March that COVID would change how we socially interact, and the change might be longer than a year or two because people do have this worry of getting sick, and this worry of getting sick plus the recommendation from CDC of social distancing, 6 feet away, stuff like that, change our way of interaction a little bit. Now I go into malls or places of closed space, with relatively high dense population. Even if I have already taken the vaccine, I still wear masks. And if I don't wear a mask, I will feel awkward. I'm Chinese, I'm Asian, so I might be a bit special in this area. And American is a bit special because of the desire to freedom. Even though I don't quite know what the mask has to do with freedom, so I can see that if I live in Asia, this change will be long lasting. Even if I'm vaccinated, even if I know the good majority of people around me have been vaccinated, I will still carry a mask with me. So that's a minor change. I don't quite know whether something similar will happen in the US. A big, but I suspect it will influence at least the behavior of some people. So with that, so that's a minor change, and the more significant change might be some way of social interaction. It is weird, have how like one thing that I noticed very clearly when I came to the US is the hugging culture, subculture, just how people tend to interact. But the US people tend to enjoy hugging. I don't quite know whether it will change, but I suspect it will go through some change. You don't want to get that intimate, or you don't want to get that intimate very easily with a lot of people anymore. Again, that's my suspicion. But these suspicions belong to what I have been thinking about the social area, the impact of COVID in the social areas, how we interact with others. Will it change how we will it have some deeper influence? I don't quite know yet. Will it have something much more significant than the relatively trivial examples I had in mind? I don't quite know yet.
Yeah, so I think that the social conventions that we have, like going around with masks, not hugging and so forth, um, I think I think we're gonna get back to the old state,
You think
like
we're
like
gonna get back
at
there?
the point by which at which the rates of infection is going to be so low, and the death, hospitalization, everything is down. I do think that people are gonna come back to to the old ways. I mean, shaking hands also. There just is something. There's something very profound, like a deep cultural norm, that desire, you could say, that exists among the people. I mean, I'm influenced by Nicholas Christakis. He's a public health scholar and sociologist, which is a rare combination. And he argued that we're going to have the Roaring Twenties, which so just as a historical context, so this is like 20th century history. After the end of World War One, right?
Hmm.
Um, that's when people were sort of celebrating, going on to parties, and it was the birth of consumer culture in the US, but I think
Hmm.
it extended globally after that. Um, mainly because of the technological innovations that were occurring in that time frame. Like basically, the first 4 decades of the 20th century was absolutely incredible in terms of the technological innovation. And and technological innovation, if it's productivity enhancing, right? If it's not like shitty, useless forms of automation, like I don't know, like what we have today with like cell phone like apps and just for entertainment purposes. Um, that's sort of like frivolous forms of technology. But actually, the ones that is like changing changing lives. I mean, so there was another book by Robert Gordon, Rise and Fall of American Growth, and he used the example of the washing machine. The washing machine was revolutionary because, um, from the perspective of women's rights in particular, because
It
what it
saved
did
a lot of time. Yeah,
exactly, it's about saving time.
yeah.
Because the expectation was again the woman is supposed to stay home and wash the clothes, so
And a
you
good
couldn't.
chunk, yeah, a good chunk of time was spent on clothes, washing clothes. Yeah.
Right, and okay, well, and then like when the industrial revolution began, there was no restriction on working hours. So basically, people were working from morning to evening until they collapsed to sleep. So it's about 70, 80 hours a week. And right around that time, in the first, I would say, 2, 3 decades of the last century, the work week went down to about 40 hours. Um, and so that's where the norms are around 19. By the mid 1930s, we have the 40-hour work week. So we put all these things together. So you have technological innovation, which is labor saving, especially in the household. Number two, you have a decline in the working hours in the job. And so, by definition, the third conclusion is that the leisure time hours is also increasing, right?
Hmm.
And um, and so that was the basis for what's called the Roaring Twenties.
The what?
Um,
The
the
warring,
roaring, yeah,
roaring. Okay,
yeah, yeah. So the idea is like exploding, like,
okay.
and, and so it means a couple of different things. I mean, it's about economics, which is um, the idea of like spending money as a permissible form of leisure activity. Um, because before that, you didn't have any consumer products, right? The whole idea of the origin of consumer products is industrial production. Like it's only when you
Yeah,
have industrial production you produce so much stuff, then you can say, hey, by the way, let's hire some marketing gurus so that we can actually sell the stuff.
yeah.
So it was in terms of economics. It was in terms of society, meaning that so I mean the examples that you used, like okay, hugging, kissing, and I mean it's like a consumptive leisure activity, but it allows for social connections. So I'm thinking of like maybe the early forms of movies,
Hmm.
like the Hollywood industry was emerging at that time. Um, you know, um, yeah, it could be like dance competitions. The
Hmm.
jazz music, it was huge. So
Yeah,
jazz was sort of developed around that time, and yeah, so that's the idea of the Roaring Twenties. And of course, you had the Great Depression, and that was the end of the Roaring Twenties. But if you sort of, we're now about 100 years later. Um, Once we put the pain of COVID behind us, you know, we could have a Roaring Twenties moment. And so Christakis, he gives the
oh, interesting. Go ahead.
because of the things that we had to suppress
Yeah,
while
yeah,
we were under the lockdown, right?
yeah,
Um, as like the extreme example he gave of what he means by it is like sexual licentiousness, right? It's this idea that
yeah,
like
yeah.
we go around and
We're just
we
going
go to
wild. Yeah,
clubs, and yeah, it's like, oh my god, like we have suppressed sexuality for so long,
yeah,
and we've got to live it again.
yeah.
Um, and I do think that this would be the possibility that we have. And then what would be our 1929 moment, a Great Depression moment? Um, I think it's going to be. it's going to be something climate related. I think that would be the thing that
Something climate really, yeah.
yeah, that would stop our party, basically, our partying.
I so some short comment on what you just said. This idea of roaring 20s is interesting for what contributes to it. It's not a single factor. It's multiplicity of reasons of multiple factors that contribute to what you call the roaring 20s. So you mentioned development of technology and then cut down of working hours and which contribute to leisure time, and then all these together give birth to different forms of entertainment and stuff like that. So if we consider a similar model, COVID would be one factor only. And I think even if we're thinking about the period now, we can probably say COVID is a factor. Now, even if we don't know what future will brings, even if we don't know what future will bring, we can probably say COVID is significant enough to be a transitional factor. The question then would be, what are other factors? I don't, so environmental issue doesn't seem to be, I mean, I don't know enough about it, but at the moment, it doesn't seem to be a changing factor yet. Maybe it seems like we both agreed sometime in the future, the bomb will tick, but not now. And so what would be other factors if this will turn out to be another roaring 20s? I'm thinking economics might be at the global scale, the money printing, the printing machines have been doing their work, have been doing their diligent duty. For all, I mean, the US, China, every central bank around the world have been printing a lot of money. And that caused a lot of attention and a lot of anxiety. That maybe
Well, inflation is the main concern, right? So, if you have too much money supply, we already see inflation
rise of
figures.
prices.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
like 3, 4, 5% now, and
Mm-hmm.
um, now there's an important debate that's happening within the economics profession about the inflation figures that are coming out now.
Yeah.
Because so the two interpretations, the first interpretation is that it's temporary and it's tied to current shortages having to do with the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
Because so what happens, like when the pandemic struck, like let's say in March of last year when they did the first shutdown, what a lot of companies are doing, because they don't know how long the shutdown is going to last,
Yeah.
is they reduce investments into their you know firm capacity, you could call it.
Yeah.
And okay, so now the issue is, like, as soon as you reopen the economy and you have all these people who, of course, the ones who didn't lose their jobs, who still have them during the pandemic as remote work or something like that, um, who couldn't spend the money. I mean, I like my parents, they wanted to go on a cruise, right, before the pandemic struck. So, fortunately, they didn't go.
Yeah.
But sort of this idea that, like, people had this desire to spend the money, and now after they're vaccinated, now you start to see, yeah, let's book the flight ticket, let's
Mm-hmm.
go on a vacation, let's go to Disney World, things like that. The problem is that it takes time for the supply to catch up with the demand, right? Because the demand is already there because people
Yeah,
have
the
the
demand
savings.
bounced back much faster than
Yeah,
the
the
bounce
purchasing
back
power.
of supply here.
Exactly, that's right. So that's the argument for short-term inflation. which means that, so if that theory is true, then we should expect that next year's inflation numbers is going to be lower
Yeah, when the
than what we
supply
have
catches
now.
up.
Right.
Yeah.
And then there's the other side of the economics profession that says that this is long-term inflation because of basically the idea is like there's this concept of inflationary expectation, which is the idea that every actor in the economy adjusts the prices based on the expectation of what other people will do with their prices. Which is to say that, like, let's say, you know, if, um, okay, let's say in the food industry, so if I'm like a restaurateur, and you are the whatever the meat producer, the
Yeah.
farmer, like if I expect you to raise the prices on, farming products, then I'm going to raise my prices as a restaurateur, right? And and then because people are paying more money on food, so then they're like, hey, my wages have to go higher, or I'm going to stop working for you.
Yeah.
So then, okay, then they pressure the employer to also hike the wages.
Yeah.
So if the assumption of inflationary expectation is true, then we could see longer term periods of inflation. If the second scenario is true, then it gives credence to the argument of what you might call monetary hawks, right? So those are people who say that in order to stabilize the price level, so to lower inflation, you have to increase the cost of money. And increasing cost of money means increasing cost of borrowing.
Yeah.
So it
Changing
means
the
interest rate.
yeah, interest
Yeah,
rate. Yeah.
you'd have to increase the interest rate. Um, because that, so if the price of borrowing goes up, then people borrow less money, and then you have less money circulation, and then that automatically reduces inflation. Um, yeah, and then, but I mean, but if the first argument is correct, that the inflation hike is temporary, well, then you shouldn't do anything with interest rates.
Yeah.
Then if you hike the interest rate and you throttle the monetary supply, all you're doing is you're increasing the suffering, of like businesses,
Yeah.
and then indirectly of workers who get laid off, right?
Yeah.
So this is an important debate. I don't know who's right. My inclination so far is that is the first argument is correct, that the inflation wave is temporary. Um, I think the long term expectation is is pointing towards deflation. And for me, it has to do with demographics, which is to say, I think it's much more likely, not over the short term. Over the short term, I mean, demography doesn't matter, but over the long term, like the next few decades, I think that the U.S. economy, the European economies, is going to look a lot more like Japan today,
Oh. Okay.
um, which which is deflationary.
Yeah.
So the deflation pressure in Japan, which means lower prices, um, comes from demographics. Is basically like because the population is shrinking and aging.
Yeah.
So you can see like the only sectors of the economy that's doing well in Japan is the economy that's serving old people. So like nursing homes and healthcare, you know, yeah, funeral, you know, those industries, you know, old age entertainment, um, yeah, those industries are doing well. Everything else is just, yeah, it's just collapsing basically. I mean, like you know, the university enrollment is going down, the
Yeah, yeah.
elementary school enrollment, um, you know, villages are just getting smaller, so yeah, they're closing and consolidating schools, you know, so
Yeah, US has I the immigration population is one had been a source of increase in population, and it would be interesting to see what happened in the long term future. European, I I don't quite know enough to say much about it.
well, so all of these countries they have much more immigration than Japan,
Yeah,
and that means that the the trend to its becoming like Japan is going to be much delayed, um, in the Western countries, especially in the U.S. Um,
yeah,
because the U.S. is much more welcoming to its immigration generally, and yeah, but then I don't know. I mean, so because of the pandemic, so they didn't issue new green cards for a while. I think now they started it again, and also because of pandemic, people are dying at a higher rate. You could imagine.
yeah.
So actually, our life expectancy declined by I think 2 years or something like that. Um, and our birth rate, our fertility rate, has been declining by like 0.01 or something, right? 0.1. And that yeah, so that's an inclination actually that we do have an aging population, and that the forces of deflation is actually going to be much stronger. You know, the other factor that we have to look at is automation, um, which is that the countries that are most aggressive with automation also tend to be the ones that have more aging. You
Mhm.
know, because basically it's about labor force replacements. Um, and yeah, so we sort of need these robots to maintain the highest standard of living that we currently enjoy. Um, and I mean, like, now the thing is, like, there's this argument that, well, okay, if the automation is happening too fast, um, then you could have an increase, in the unemployment rate. Um, which I mean, my argument is, the more unemployment, the better, under the under the condition that that you have UBI and social
Yeah,
programs.
yeah,
And of course, like, it would be crazy if you said, okay, well, higher unemployment is good. Period. Like, so people are
yeah,
begging on the street. That would be terrible. Yeah.
yeah. I'm thinking going back to the previous question, the previous big question. I'm thinking whether these would be sufficient of a turning point. Now, automation has been a developing trend, and it will continue to develop. But COVID doesn't seem to present a unique turning point, or not to my knowledge. Maybe after COVID is done, then there is a realization for there. Then maybe there's a realization that we need more robots. I don't quite know.
Well, that's exactly that would be the point, however, because
You think that will happen?
right. So what happened, for instance, we saw that the single biggest industry that was destroyed by COVID,
Mhm.
um,
Hospitality.
yeah, it's hospitality, it's
Yeah.
hotels, and then the airlines,
Yeah.
um, and in those areas, okay, so piloting is largely automated. I mean, you still have two pilots that are sitting there.
Uh-huh.
But you could say, well, okay, I mean, if you're like a flight attendant, well, that's not automated yet. Um, but there's some experiments along the way to do that. Also, yeah, like in hotels, cleaning robots have been in use much more than before because of course, there's a concern that to keep the visitors safe from the infected staff.
And also
Um,
the janitors, they don't want to do it either.
yeah, janitors don't want to do this kind of job anymore. And actually, when I was doing the research dissertation, I was reading union documents of hotel workers, and they in 2018 they started to um, add automation as part of the union clause, which is to
Yeah, I
say,
think you go ahead.
yeah, I mean, the basic argument is that if the management wants to introduce automation, the the workers would have to be informed. I think like half a year before it gets introduced, and it would have to be in consultation with the union, and the workers would have to be retrained,
Yeah.
redeployed, or some other accommodation. That's very interesting. It was before the pandemic. It was 2018. Um, Now, because of the pandemic, I would say that that those unions would be even more interested
In
in
that.
in those kinds of agreements, in strengthening those agreements. Now it's a question whether they have the leverage to do so, right? Because if a lot of these people are furloughed, it's like, are they going to be brought back again
Mhm.
at the same rate? Um, we do have job recovery, and it's not surprising to hear that the biggest job recovery was happening in the hospitality sector.
I mean, that's the sector that
That
lost
lost the
most
most.
jobs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So,
So you do think automation would run into a turning point during or immediately after COVID?
yeah, because so this is not my argument. So it goes back to David Autor. He's an expert in labor economics, and he's studied automation for 20 years now. And yes, I attended one of his presentations over the summer, and I mean, it's a very simple idea. It's that, like, if an employer introduced automation, like, they're not going to retire the robot when the
Mhm.
pandemic is over because you already invested the money in it.
Yeah.
I mean, of course. So, what about smaller businesses who basically shut down during the pandemic instead of introducing a robot, and now they're opening up again? Well, of course, for those employers, yeah, they're going to hire back the workers, right? But if you're like an employer who laid off or furloughed those workers, then introduced the robots, you're not going to go back to the workers when the economy goes back to normal, right? So that was just a very simple argument, and um, yeah, and then the other big argument he's making is about teleworking. So um,
Yeah.
the idea that, so it's complicated because the bosses want the workers to come back to the physical workspace
Yeah.
because it's just easier to control the
Easier to
staff.
control, easier to communicate,
Yeah.
efficiency of the company can increase.
Now, from the worker perspective, it's kind of the opposite, especially for
Oh, for yeah, that's right.
introverted personalities.
I think yeah, I've heard. I mean, yeah, you haven't finished your argument, so I should be quick. I just say that I have heard both about efficiency. They're for workers who need to drive, not to talk about introverts, just talk about daily schedule. They need to drive back and forth, spend time with different logistics stuff if they need to go out, putting oil and stuff like that. Put aside all the accidents that could happen on the way. They would take more time from their day if they need to go back to be physically present in the office. So that's a counter argument. The pro argument is about communication and teamwork. To working along with someone else, communicating more effectively with someone else, doing it in person would be better than from like a Zoom call. But yeah, this doesn't really matter to your larger argument, a lot which has to do with whether COVID is a turning point for automation.
Yeah, but I mean, just on this teleworking point, I think that um, it's definitely the case that yeah, some workers they just wanted to stay home
Mm,
and continue, earning income in that way, and there's going to be much more openings that do remote work actually.
yeah.
Um, but then to get at this other point, which is, if you want to do brainstorming, if you want to get new ideas, it is much better to do it in person. And in those cases, I think that they would do hybrid.
Mm,
So it's like
yeah.
1 or 2 days in the office,
Yeah.
and then the remaining parts of the week it would be done from the home. And I think that would be the best arrangement to do it. But then I mean, there's another worry that I have, which is the existence of BS jobs, bullshit jobs,
Yeah.
useless jobs, um, which is that in during the pandemic, did people sort of contemplate deeply about whether the jobs that they're doing is adding value to the society, and
Hmm.
whether they wanted to continue doing it? And the pandemic was sort of a moment where people could actually, develop thoughts about it.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I've asked a lot of my academic colleagues, and it's like, yeah, I sort of asked them, like, you imagine, like, you stop publishing papers. Like, what
What
would
a
happen to
question.
society? What would happen to society? Right? I mean, it's like, I mean, and then I was like, pick other extreme examples where it's like, take, say, the trash collector, the guy who picks up my trash every week.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like, if he didn't pick it up even one day, I was like, I would go crazy, man. Like, with the trash piling up so quickly, right? So I was like, okay, Now, I'm not advocating for all academics to become trash collectors now.
Yeah.
That would be quite extreme application here, but it does raise important questions about philosophically about again, going back to this original question, what brings contentment,
Yeah.
um,
And the value of work that we're doing, does it actually add something?
yeah, I always like to say that whether you do something valuable or not, I think should really depend on you. So if you said, I wanted to study, ancient Greek philosophy, I wanted to study, um, sociology of work, or whatever respective interests are, um, as long as it's valuable to us, it is valuable. But then you see, the problem is that, in the capitalist commodification logic, right? It's like that's not good enough.
Yeah.
Like, you have to provide a service to the society. The society wants to buy it, has to want to buy it. Otherwise you're useless, you're a leech,
Yeah.
you don't deserve anything, and that to me is just this is the most ridiculous logic. And I was like, And so you see, what's also very disappointing, in my view, is that if you're a politician of the left or the right, because there's always like, oh, the left and the right, they have different opinions, but on this one issue, there's no disagreement, which is we need to create jobs, right? Because the left wing argues um, that we need good paying jobs. We have to stop the exploitation of bosses. We have to strengthen labor unions.
Hmm.
Workers have to have more of a say in the workplace. And then the right wing argues uh, more from like a moral perspective, which is, people shouldn't be lazy. Basically, people shouldn't live
Hmm.
at the expense of other people. They should feel that they're useful for the community. And but it's like regardless of what justificatory logic you're using, right? On the left or on the right, we have to create more jobs. And I don't know. I guess we're going back to this tongue ping. It's like,
Yeah, yeah,
what's the value of that? What's the value of that reasoning? I mean, it's a third way. It's a third way of reasoning about meaning of life. And yeah, that's something that that I've been thinking about as well. I mean, yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that like disturbs me, like at the heart of the automation debate, right? Which is so there's like two perspectives that exist in the automation of work argument, um, which is you know either automation is going too fast and then we're losing too many jobs, or and this is bad. We have to create new jobs.
hmm,
And the second perspective is don't worry about it because um, like there will always be something that we find for people to do, right? There's always a niche that people
yeah,
can fill out. And you see the third perspective, which is let's automate as quickly as possible so that people can do whatever they want
yeah, yeah,
outside the labor market. I mean, that's unacceptable. Nobody can say that, right?
yeah.
That's the thing that makes me very
But
upset.
that would be your view.
Yeah, but then it's like that. But then again, we're going back to the pandemic. It's like, do we have an opening there? I mean, did the pandemic shift anything about how we should think about value of work, meaning of life, things like that?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
Um, I mean, the most dystopian vision actually is sort of like, no, nothing much changes. I mean, it's
I don't think
mm,
that's true. I mean, but well, what do you mean that nothing has changed?
well, I mean, or not too much will change. I mean, it's like, uh,
You mean the the economic structure, the social structure doesn't nothing much will change?
yeah, it's basically like, so the big trend that we know that's happening in just in terms of work is that almost all the job growth, I would say 90+% is happening in unstable jobs, right?
I see what you mean.
Low
Yeah,
wage
which
jobs.
was not that different from before the pandemic.
Yeah, right. It's like, I mean, even if you look at the academic job board nowadays, it's like
Yeah,
most of the faculty jobs is like adjunct lecturer.
yeah, yeah,
It's like they're hiring so many of them. It's like, oh yeah, that's easy thing to get for you. If you want to get those jobs, we'll make it easy for you.
yeah. It is. I now I see what you mean. It would be an interesting question whether there are some long-lasting, significant changes because of the pandemic. Yeah, and we can. I mean, we have discussed some potential changes, like your example of roaring 20s. Maybe we're at this turning point. Maybe we are. Maybe we're not. Economic inflation, automation, and I'm also thinking whether the U.S. is at a political turning moment. I don't have a very clear view of that. I just see since Trump, we have more and more conflict among the US, the US people regarding politics, but I don't quite know enough to say whether there's a turning point. And
Yeah,
so all these seem to be making painting a picture of major changes happening already now or along the way. But there are also other things you just mentioned that seem to be going back to the old way.
yeah. So let's sort of dissect this political phenomenon. In the U.S. case, it would be Trump. I mean, we have to explain
Yeah,
how he came to power and whether it could happen again.
yeah, yeah,
And the answer, I think, is yes, it can happen again. I mean, so the reason why he lost the re-election is because of the pandemic, right? So he handled
yeah.
it very
Pretty
poorly. He
poorly.
sort of
Yeah.
made fun of people instead of working constructively to contain it. Um, and so in a disaster moment, if you had a true disaster, whether it's a natural disaster or climate change related or pandemic related, you want to have a competent manager who knows how to you know manage the natural resources
Hmm.
to address the problem. In those scenarios, if you have a populist leader, it's a very bad thing to have. But but I think there are certain structural forces in place in U.S. society that would favor,
A
a
populist ruler.
yeah, a new populist movement, essentially. Yeah, because again, I think it all goes back to this. It's economics, yes, but it's some, like, mixed with this issue of social status. So in the old days, like if I was a high school graduate or high school dropout, I could walk into any factory, I could apply for a job, I would get it, I would work there for 20, 30 years.
Hmm. And
I
I
would
would
be able to buy a
retire.
house,
Yeah.
start a family, and retire decently.
Hmm.
If that option is no longer available, and we haven't made that option available to people, that's why we have like these high enrollments in colleges, right?
Yeah.
Because basically we haven't actually found a way to accommodate our young people. So why is it that you force, our generation to take out student debt in order to get a college degree that doesn't guarantee us a middle class job? I mean, it's just gonna and 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 the system doesn't really have an answer for us. I mean, like, of course, like there's a reason why it's happening, is because we don't have these jobs, because we know we're not growing the economy as we used to in the old days.
Yeah.
Um, and you can only fund an expansion of the middle class out of an increase in total consumption. Really, that's the only way you grow these jobs. Um, so okay, so then we're not offering these jobs to young people, and then you have these leaders who say, "Vote for me, and I'll give you the dignity back." It's all bullshit, obviously, right? Like they're not doing it. Um, but they say, "Hey, look at this foreigner. The foreigner took away your job. Look at this Mexican guy.
Hmm.
Look at this Chinese guy."
Yeah.
Um, and and yeah, it's just stoking the animosity in broader society. So, and yeah, so my prediction of politics of populism is that you know it is going to get worse, and it could come to a point that democracy could actually end. Because you could say, well, okay, January 6th was not successful, um, because the mob that the former president was inciting basically wasn't big enough, and it didn't have support from inside the institutions. Right? There were no judges, there were no military generals, there were no political leaders in the capital that was supporting Trump,
Hmm.
and that's why he failed. But I mean, but maybe next time they succeed. You know, um, I mean, like political systems are, again. I go back to Aristotle. Like this guy explained it so well. It's like, like he talks about like the cycles of like political systems, right? Because in his view, democracy is a temporary structure that would devolve into tyranny, um, because well, I mean, it has to do with like mismanagement. It's usually some kind of like, we didn't manage some stressful event well,
Yeah,
and then there's a tyrant who says, "You vote for me, and I'm going to protect you,"
yeah.
and then of course that guy becomes a dictator. So if democracy is a tyranny, um, from tyranny, I don't know whether you can go back. I mean, it could swing back again to its democratic model. Uh,
Yeah, I don't quite know. That reminds me of Nazi Germany.
yeah, Nazi Germany actually they did bounce back.
Yeah,
They had democracy in the 1920s, and then they voted for the Nazis, and then
and
after
it went back. Yeah,
45, well, after 45, it went back in West Germany. It didn't actually, because in East Germany, the Soviet Union took over, and
yeah.
Soviet Union was not democratic. Um,
So it could be that in terms of politics, the election of Trump could be a turning point. If we count that, it take that into consideration, then we might start to mark a turning period, not any specific year, but a turning period. So from Trump 2016 to the pandemic, and add or minus a few years, maybe add a few years, maybe so 2016 to, let's say, I don't know, 2023, 24, something like that. We
and
might
by turning point, you mean from democratic to authoritarian, essentially.
no, by turning point I meant, um so yeah, so by that I just meant multiple major events happening during this period, and collectively they contribute to some significant changes that, the influence of which we are not seeing yet. See, I'm going back to, but I'm thinking about a lot. I'm thinking about the
You're
first
very
question.
Hegelian in your way of thinking. It's like
Am I?
there's some teleology that you're
No, not
going after.
necessarily going towards some direction, but more in terms of, okay, another example that I have in mind would be the 10 years of cultural revolution in China. I mean, it's marked as the 10 years of cultural revolution, but multiple events happening during that period. I'm not saying that it's the same thing here in the US or globally. All I meant is that sometimes there is a period of time, a few years of time, where major events happen, and collectively they shape how decades afterwards are played out. I don't quite know whether we are in that period. I just feel like, if anything, pandemic seems to be significant enough to be a part of the candidate.
Yeah, well, did you read the book by Walter Scheidel? It's about
Say more.
the Four Horsemen. And so his argument is that there are four factors historically that contributed to a decline of income inequality.
Hmm.
And it's basically cataclysmic events um, of political nature or of our interaction with ecology. Um, so the political events is like revolution and state breakdown. Those are two separate factors. The third is war, and the fourth is disease.
Yeah,
Um, so yeah, if you just focus on disease,
we already have it.
yeah, right. The inequality decreased at the end of the plague, the Black Death in
Uh-huh.
1340s, 1350s, and what happened within a period of 5 to 6 years was that so there were more commoners, laborers, and peasants and serfs who died than lords, landlords. And of course, by definition, that will be true because there's always more commoners than there's lords, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And that shifted the balance of power because the landlord cannot be a landlord unless he has serfs
yeah,
by definition, right? Because you cannot you cannot grow the food by yourself.
yeah.
Even if you, I mean, especially if your land is huge, right? So, so what happened was the land. So after the end of the plague, the landlords tried to force the remaining workers to work, but there's a distinction that happened in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe, and that's like the a source of the different trajectories of both sides of the continent. So in Western Europe, you had free labor mobility, which means that if you didn't like the Lord, you could just move a couple of kilometers away to basically apply for a job with another Lord. And that Lord would basically give you a higher wage than the Lord that you left.
Hmm.
So there was a lot of bargaining power to the serfs and the peasants. In Eastern Europe, they passed a law sanctioned by the state which prohibited labor mobility. Right? So they basically forced the remaining peasants to stay
Hmm.
uh, in the plot of land. And the end effect of that, well, the end of it's two different political cultures, So Western political culture that came out of Western Europe, what's the characteristic? Rule of law, democracy, freedom of speech. It's like the whole list of factors that we associate with like Western liberal thought. And in Eastern Europe, I mean, yeah, you don't have that. I mean, it's basically how would you summarize it? It's Tsarism, right? I mean, just listen to like I think in the Financial Times they had an interview with Vladimir Putin, and they asked him, hey, what do you think about whatever these political issues, and Putin basically just said, okay, I don't share these Western principles. This like liberal
Yeah, yeah.
ideology and individual freedom. I mean, it's a Western invention, like that kind of stuff, right? Um, yeah. Anyway, but like but the point being that the plague um allowed for, you know, less inequality. Um, Now, okay, so then interestingly, last year, at the height of the lockdown, Walter Scheidel, he publishes an article in the New York Times opinion piece, and he says that COVID is not comparable with the plague because because of the percentages. So the plague basically killed 1/3 of the population, something like that, right?
Hmm.
Or even more, even I don't know, maybe two
Yeah, I
thirds.
mean 30 to 60% of European population. The Black Death, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, COVID kills 1% of the people that get infected. And I consider that because of vaccination campaign, because not everybody gets infected all at once, right? So maybe the death rate is like 0.1% or something like that, right?
Yeah. Global death rate, yeah, it's about 0.1.
Yeah. So that's, I mean, if people are reproducing at the rate that they currently do, I would say within the next 10 years, we're going to get back to the old population figure.
I think COVID, in terms of in terms of wealth distribution, resembles the Matthew effect more than and does not have any equalizing impact. The Matthew effect, by that I meant the
Because
rich just get rich.
the rich countries
Yeah,
get vaccinated first.
and also the people inside the rich country, those who have the worst medical attention, medical equipment, and medical resources, die the most. So for me, COVID presents another case example of the Matthew effect.
It's more
Then
inequality. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, and also there was this idea about like work. Um, so basically, you have three groups of people essentially, right? So you have the teleworkers, people who are able to commute basically by at home
mhm,
office. People like you and me, like we can write our articles wherever we want, right? Um, the second category were the essential workers,
yeah,
so, like supermarket and delivery drivers and hospital workers. Um, and then the third category were, yeah, unemployed. Now, okay, you could say, well, I mean, they got extra unemployment benefits, so maybe in terms of consumption, they were not much worse off. But still, there's a shock of being unemployed, and yeah, and then it's like, well, who's the worst off? I mean, the best off is certainly the first category, the teleworkers,
yeah,
because they have very very low virus exposure risk. They have, relatively speaking, the highest paychecks because these are professional people, right? These are not laborers. Um, yeah, and also the savings rate was high
yeah.
for those category of people because again, you couldn't spend it on anything. I mean, you spend all the money on like you know like your house bills and the food delivery basically. Yeah, so there's quite some changes, um, but yeah, Scheidel is very pessimistic on the inequality reducing effect of COVID.
I think I'm in the same boat with him or her.
Yeah, with him, yeah, it's and I would agree, yeah, with that as well. Yeah, it is a huge challenge. I mean, trying to figure out like um, what what the pandemic would do. I think the you see, I think we're going to bounce back. On a lot of factors. Like the economy is going to stabilize to the level before. um, like people are gonna be, hugging and kissing again, basically, strangers. Um, the thing that I would be worried about, um, is that, yeah, it's basically like the human interaction with nature. That's my biggest concern.
Hmm.
I mean, it's been a concern basically since the beginning of time, but it's gotten really, really bad recently, right? So just to stick with the example of the pandemic, right? Like, about this, like the lab leak hypothesis, where it's like, oh well, did the virus come out of a lab in
Yeah.
Wuhan?
Hmm.
And well, the answer is like we don't really know for sure, but regardless of where it came from, I mean, it is something about human nature interaction, right? That was screwed up. So if it was a lab leak, then it's obviously a human mistake, um, that 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 started it. But even if we assume that it came from directly from nature, it's still the question of like, how does a human get in touch with a naturally occurring disease? If it wasn't for basically going out there and meeting the wild animals, right? Um,
Hmm.
whether it was like eating them or whether it was just being very close to them physically. But the fact that we were being put in touch, um, with these, with these animals that cause a virus, I think that should give us the pause, essentially. Um, yeah, and the other human nature interaction is, of course, with the climate. Yeah, it's just everything that I read in the news. I mean, it's like there's bad news everywhere. Essentially, I mean,
Yeah.
the floods in Zhengzhou, the floods in Germany. There's like a wildfire in the western U.S.
Yeah.
Extreme drought. Like this morning, I was reading about like in Afghanistan, they also had floods. 80 people killed. Um, and it's like, well, okay, you could say, well, this is bound to happen. I mean, natural catastrophes, but you could document like an overtime trend where it is getting worse and worse, essentially, right? Um, because yeah, just on the issue of floods, for instance, why do the floods happen? Um, because, well, there's two reasons. So the first is, um, that warmer air holds more moisture. So because like if it's cooler, then usually the water, like if it's very cold, then the water stays as ice on the ground. If it's kind of cool, then it's just water that's on the ground. Now if it warms up a lot, then you have evaporation, and evaporation means that the air holds more moisture.
Hmm.
And then the second reason is because of the jet stream. So there's two things that's happening with the jet stream. So that's like the band of wind that's, um, basically bringing the like weather from other parts of the world.
Yeah.
And so the first thing that happens is it gets weaker, which means that the speed at which it travels is slower. And the second is it becomes more wavy. So and that does like basically the weather patterns that would usually be carried forward to another location gets stuck in one location. So you have a low pressure system in one area, and that causes extreme buildup of moisture, extreme rainfall, and floods. And then elsewhere, you have like a high pressure region that gets stuck in one location. And what you get there is like a very dry heat wave. And the heat wave then, you know, um, it just means that there's less water available for agriculture. So I don't know. I say basically a lot of things are happening right now.
Yeah,
Um, that I mean, what's the end effect of it? I think it makes our survival difficult. And I would say that, but I think you and I, we can say that we're old enough that we can say that our youth has not been ruined by climate change. The way that
I would
that,
agree.
that, that, that
Yeah,
Greta Thunberg would argue. It's
yeah,
gonna
we're
be
old
our
enough.
middle age and our old age that's gonna be ruined,
Yeah,
but our youth has been fine, I guess.
yeah, for better or for worse.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so I think I will stop the recording here if that will be fine with you. And well, thank you, Wenhui, for the participating in the podcast. Unless you have another thing that the world has to know about. Okay, good. Thank you very much.